Daniel Hannan is with us, European Member of Parliament. Daniel, welcome back to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Nice to be back with you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, your perspective from where you are, and do you agree with me that my greatest fear in all of this is the emergence of an Islamic radical state?
Exactly. Nobody wants the emergence of any kind of anti-democratic or authoritarian regime. The question is what is happening now likely to lead to that? And here I think, good people can disagree, but my own view, Sean, is the West has made a mistake. We were so scared of the prospect of some of these Muslims taking over that we ended up propping up some terrible, terrible strongmen. I mean, really nasty dictatorships around the region. And we've ended up creating the very thing we were trying to avoid, because what happens, I'm going to, the only time I'm ever going to quote Lenin on your program, but Lenin had this great phrase about a rotten regime exporting its contradictions. There is a process whereby these vicious kleptocracies end up driving young men into the hands of the extremists. And how about this? I just discovered this quote the other day. How is this for somebody who I'm not always a big fan of, but he deserves kudos on this? This was George Bush II. Back in 2004, he said, "For too long, many nations, including my own, tolerated, even excused oppression in the Middle East in the name of stability. Oppression became common, but stability never arrived. We must take a different approach. We must help the reformers of the Middle East as they work for freedom and strive to build a community of peaceful democratic nations." You know what? I think he's, 5 years after the event, I think he's being vindicated.
Well, I think he's being vindicated, and I think that was his modus operandi throughout his entire presidency, and he never wavered. And but even still, if you look at, for example, the U.S. and the U.K.'s relationship with Egypt, for example, everybody has known that he is a dictator. Everybody's known that the people of Egypt are suffering. Everybody's known that he has flaws. But on the other hand, he did create some stability in the region, at least with the agreement that upheld for 30 years with Israel.
Yeah, but you know what? It was an agreement that was reached by a dictatorial regime. And a consequence, an almost direct and immediate consequence of that, is that Israel has become, in the view of most Israeli analysts, the most anti-Semitic society in the region, because there was never a peace between peoples. Now, I would much rather, if we're talking about Middle Eastern peace, I'm
not sure what do you mean? Can you just go over that again? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
What I mean is, a democracy can make a peace. Right? An elected government can win the argument and say, we are now putting aside our differences with this neighboring country. And the country, the electorate debates that, comes to a view and says, yeah, we've had enough. That's a different thing from a government that is seen as a puppet regime of somebody else imposing a peace which its own people have never gone through the mental process of accepting. And I think it is in Israel's long-term interest, I say this as a friend of Israel, I think it is in Israel's long-term interest to live next to regimes based on parliamentary democracy. And even if in the short term there is some question over the hardly affectionate, albeit cordial and correct relationship that they have with Egypt, in the long run, what is in Israel's interest is to have a neighbor which resembles Israel more, or resembles the West more, in the sense that it's a parliamentary system.
I get that, but based on your argument, if we take, for example, the 79 Iranian Revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini coming into power and the resulting theocracy that exists, and oppression of people in the process, and the stoning to death of women, and Sharia law and all that is associated with it, I mean, by your argument there that we should have abandoned the Shah, which was far better for the United States, world stability, than the regime that we have there now, which is now fomenting terror around the world.
Makes the point, doesn't it? I mean, the argument for backing the Shah was exactly the same as the argument for backing Mubarak, or indeed the argument for backing the Saudis, or the argument for backing that swine Karimov in Uzbekistan. People said, oh no, the alternative is a terrible fundamentalist state. Well, as Sarah Palin might say, how's that working out for you? I mean, we ended up creating the thing that we were trying to avoid. Now, frankly, I think it is inconceivable that the Ayatollahs would win a free election in Iran today. I just think it is inconceivable that if there were a free and fair election, people
I think it's inconceivable, but
for a continuation of that regime.
But we saw what happened at the first sign of any democracy movement, and even the United States, frankly, had an opportunity to show solidarity with the young students that were uprising in Iran, and the president of the United States, Barack Obama, did not go in their direction. He said, no, if Ahmadinejad remains in power, I'll deal with them.
Yeah, you see, I think that is a very legitimate criticism, and it's a criticism you could make of a lot of the EU governments as well. I think we could be a lot more proactive backing the reformers and the Democrats around the Middle East, but we've got to then be consistent about this. If we're doing it in Iran, we should be doing it in Egypt. And, you know, the great thing, there was Margaret Thatcher's guru, the man, her John the Baptist, if you like, was a great figure called Keith Joseph, who later served as her education secretary. And he had this great phrase, which is, if you give people more responsibility, they behave more responsibly. Now, some of these outfits, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they thrive on persecution. They thrive on the mystique of repression. There's no way that they would win an outright majority, but let's say that out of the democratic revolution in Egypt came a government which contained an Islamic component as part of the coalition. Once that party had to start wheeling and dealing with all the compromises that attend on parliamentary politics, it would very quickly lose its appeal. The solution... The great thing is not whether to say, is this country ready for democracy? Democracy makes a country ready. Democracy improves a country.
I agree with all you're saying. Let me just tell you why I am concerned. And I think you have really hit the nerve in terms of the moral quandary that exists. And as I read debate among conservatives, even in this country now, about the right path to follow as we move forward, I'm hearing your argument and arguments on the other side. Look, I'll predicate my comments. I agree the natural inclination of the human soul, their yearning is to be free. And when given that opportunity, they will thrive, and that would result in a better world, a freer world, a safer world, because as people pursue their own natural talents and interests and have some degree of prosperity, it's better for everybody. Here's the problem. If the ultimate problem that we're seeing in Yemen and Lebanon and Egypt and Tunisia and Jordan, and more specifically in Egypt right now, and is that the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies, if I'm right that they are the 21st century equivalent to say that what the Communist Party was to the 20th century, their very existence is a threat to democracy and individual liberty and women's rights and freedom of religion. The problem is, look how long it takes to end such tyranny. If we go back to the, 1917 revolution in the Soviet Union.
Of course, that's the worry, that you get one man, one vote.
Okay, so and then now we can go back to the 1979 revolution in Iran, and right. Things have not changed. So in that sense, I think it makes
what I would say to you, Sean, is if our own policy, and by ours I mean the West generally, has therefore failed in its own terms, because the net effect of backing some of these horrible regimes has been to turn the Muslim movements into the principal oppositions. They're quite sly, some of these secular Arab strongmen. They're quite clever at bidding for international sympathy by pretending that anyone who opposes their dictatorship is a fundamentalist. And the danger of that argument is that it eventually becomes self-fulfilling, that if you repeatedly tell a population that the only alternative to a horrible regime is radical Islam, then eventually people will start thinking, well, maybe there's something in it. If they're the only alternative to these bastards, maybe I should have a look at it. And so that's why, leave aside, if you like, the ethical arguments for, as you said, as you neatly put it, the yearning for freedom in every human soul. Simply in terms of realpolitik, I think our policy has been a failure. In the Cold War, we had to back some unpleasant people. As FDR is supposed to have said about Somoza, he was a son of a bitch, but he was our son of a bitch. Well, the Cold War is over. We don't need to say that anymore. Now we can say, yeah, well, he may be our son of a bitch, but he's a son of a bitch. And we can do better.
Yeah, I guess the added urgency at this particular point, this moment in history, is that, if you look at a little country like Israel and look at, Lebanon and Syria and Egypt and Jordan and Yemen and all these countries that surround it, and you add nuclear proliferation to the equation and, Iranian influence and Hamas influence and Hezbollah influence and the Muslim Brotherhood and a desire for an Islamic caliphate and Sharia law and total oppression of literally the entire region. I just don't know if I don't accept the premise that we are to blame for we are to blame for propping up their destiny, because I think every human being has an obligation, if they yearn for freedom, to fight for freedom.
No, that's right. But I think we have hurt our own cause by.
Now, there's some truth. Well, but what was our option, though? I mean, maybe everything's 20/20 hindsight, but if we didn't back the Shah, if we didn't back Mubarak, what would have? I guess we'll never know the answer.
Well, I think we can be a little bit more imaginative than this. I think that the surest way of killing Islamic fundamentalism, or indeed any other anti-democratic ideology, Soviet communism or anything else that we were talking about earlier, is to create a property-based liberal society where people have a stake in freedom and in free trade, in ownership arbitrated by courts, in the right to make choices politically. Very quickly, these fundamentalist outfits lose their appeal. You don't have examples of these fundamentalist organizations taking over successful secular countries. When they do best is when they're against a horrible repressive regime like the Shah's. If they do end up in government, as in Turkey, then they end up having to compromise with the status quo. They end up becoming very boring politicians like everybody else and having to operate within the parameters of a more or less secular state. So I think, you want to house train these guys, if you like, and that means giving them the same opportunity to make mistakes that every other politician has.
Yeah, well, where do we go from here? I guess, because we can argue this in principle, but I guess my greatest fear is knowing the Muslim Brotherhood